And welcome to day 5. Thanks so much for showing up, everyone. I'm super excited to get into this one because we're going to be talking about users and user authentication. We're going to do it sort of the hard way. It's really easy if you understand the last few days. Really easy in the sense that we're going to be pretty much putting together everything that we've already done. And not to worry, I'll be going step by step. So even if you didn't fully get everything from before, hopefully this will make it a lot more clear on how you use forms, how you use models, how you use them all together in a way that actually associates your user. So of course, our normal agenda, not any surprises here probably for those of you who have been with me since day 1. Let's go ahead and just jump in. This overview is going to be incredibly short because the value, I think, is really where the code is. And so this is where we're at, right? We've got a request coming in. That request can be kind of two types, right? If it's an HTTP GET, well, it could have data in there too, but if it's not an HTTP GET, it has some data. That's that little graph there, a chart there. And then HTTP post, that goes up either way. Whatever the request is, whether it's an HTTP GET or an HTTP post, it goes to some URL on your page. Now, this is common across all web applications, not just Django. The green stuff is where Django comes in. So once you either get or post data, that goes into a URL. That URL decides which view should actually handle that request. That view then also decides whether or not it's going to be using a form. So if it is using a form, it will validate the form and do all that stuff. And once the form is validated, the form data will be sent back to the view, and the view will then update the database through Django models. And then, of course, the view also ends up sending back a response of some kind, which has been so much about Django templates and rendering out Django templates. So every web application does roughly this, or should do some version of this, as no surprise. So the big thing that we want to do is insert this idea of a user and not a user. So someone that's actually authenticated with the system, like they have a password, they actually log in to their version of the application. They log in and create a session themselves. So that's actually what we want to be doing. And something I've alluded to before is every request has a user attached to it. This is a batteries included thing that Django has, so request.user. And there's also something that's also built into every request, which is sessions. So request.sessions. Sessions are really, really useful that work in conjunction with the user, where the session itself will be persistent throughout the session. Like every time the user's on there, that session can stay on there, which is really useful for us because if a user purchases a product, for example, we want to be able to know that, yeah, they've recently purchased this product, and we can leave that in the session itself. This will come up a lot more later, but for now, just know that these two things are attached to every single request that's coming through. So they're accessible in a lot of these places and accessible in a lot of this like flow of a request. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the code. I told you it would be a very, very quick overview because this is so much about actually getting the code down. Okay, so I already have my server running. I actually do want to mention a couple things prior to jumping into the code because I get this a lot that I go way too fast, and this is probably true, but the Django documentation has a lot more things that I won't be covering on authentication. Now, some of these things are just nice to know. Some of these things are places you'll actually, or things that you'll actually use. So I do recommend that you go through this and read about it because this has been pretty standard for years. So even if you just learn a little bit about it, that's going to be okay. And you could always do this later, like after you implement your own authentication. Next is the actual settings module itself. There's all sorts of configuration you can do here. This is something that I probably should have mentioned a long time ago, but I'm mentioning it now because we actually will do some configuration in relation to our login and our session. And then the final thing is Django AllAuth. Now, this is a really, really impressive tool and package for doing authentication. Now, I think a lot of beginners want to jump to the easiest possible thing, and I totally get that. Django All-Auth definitely makes it really easy to just do user authentication. It does social authentication too, but the user authentication that it'll do, or at least help us with, is almost identical to what we're going to be doing here, except they implement a few other features that is really nice to use. So Django All-Auth is something you'll want to check out in the future. Okay, so now let's go ahead and actually look at the code itself. So I'm going to go ahead and close out all of these things, and I'm going to make a new view inside of a new application. So I'll go ahead and do Python manage.py start app, and we're going to call this accounts. Now, accounts is fairly arbitrary. I don't want to necessarily call it users because I already have a user model inside of Django. I'm also not going to be creating a user model because Django itself has a user model. I don't need to do it. It's built into Django. You can, for more advanced users, you can absolutely change that default Django user model, but it's just something outside the context of what we really need for this project. So what I'm actually going to be focusing on is the view as well as forms. So the only reason I have this accounts app is for views and forms and to be situated in someplace outside of my other stuff, right? I actually don't need this to be in accounts, but I'm doing it to make it like, oh, well, if they're logging in, where would that view naturally sit? Well, you can make an app called auth. That's an option, but you can also just use accounts. This is kind of a design pattern that's completely up to you. Okay, so without talking about that too much, let's actually take a look at actually how to use that user model. So first and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new terminal window here, and then I'll activate my virtual environment, source bin /activate. And of course, if you're on Windows, script /activate. And we'll go ahead and go into the Python managed shell, Django managed shell, and we'll actually import the user model. Now, there's a lot of different ways within Django that you can get the default user model. The way I recommend is going from django.contrib.auth. We're going to import the get user model function. This function is useful if you're using the default Django user model or if you're using a custom user model. So when in doubt, this is a really, really good way to grab that user model itself. So we're going to go ahead and say user equals to get user model and actually call that function. Now I can do stuff like user.objects.all, and that will actually give me a query set, or as in all of the users that are stored in my database. Okay, so that's actually how we're going to go about doing this. We're going to be using that default user model. And to create users, I actually want to show you how to do it the raw way before we actually put it into the view itself. But to create users, there's two ways to do it. You can do user.objects.create. Much like any other actual model, you can use user.objects.create and say something like username equals to jmitch and email, or rather, email equals to something at something.com and hit enter. Okay, so I had a little formatting issue with my terminal, but that's something you probably won't see. I made some changes to my terminal, so that's why I got that little issue. But when I copy and paste it, this is actually the command. I hit enter, it actually creates a user object for me. If I try to do that again, I get an error, right? So unique constraint failed. So by default, built into Django, you have unique usernames, not unique emails, just unique usernames. So we actually probably want to overcome the email portion. So that's something to think about for our form, right? So right off the bat, I'm going to make a little note here in a file called forms.py. So inside accounts, I'll go ahead and make forms.py here now. And I want to say check for unique email and username. Okay, so we'll come back to that for sure. But now that I've got this, I can actually try the other method of creating a user, which is user.objects.create_user. Now we can actually pass in a username string, an email, so abc@abc.com, which might be a real email. And then we can actually pass in a password. So ABC123 and hit enter. So before I actually didn't set a password with the other user. So objects, user.objects.createUser does set that password, whereas user.objects.create did not set a password. So to actually set a password on a user object, we use something called setPassword. So to do this, we'll go ahead and say user equals to user.objects.get. Let's go ahead and say username equals to ABC. And now I do user.set underscore password, and then whatever I want to set it to. So let's say ABC1234, which is a terrible password, never use that. And then we can just call user.save. User.setPassword should actually save it to the database, but when in doubt, just do user.save. So this method actually works anytime. So you can do it on this create user right here. As you notice, it actually sends me back an instance of that user object. You can also do it on the model itself, right? So this right here, you can call it after that as well. Like you can literally chain it together from this and call setPassword after it if you were so inclined. But of course, this is important for us to actually do registration and authentication. So this right here is called an instance method. So is save itself. An instance method means that it actually happens on an instance of that model, right? So this right here is creating a model and returning an instance of that model, which is basically just one single object from that model itself. That of course is Python specific, but I get a lot of questions on what an instance method is. That's this right here. It's essentially a function inside of a class. Okay, so now we've got some basics down. Don't worry if you didn't actually get all of these commands down. I definitely have to do them inside of views.py to make sure that this works. So let's actually go into the form. Now I actually want to design the form for this. So going back to what I just did, which was from django.contrib.auth, we're going to go ahead and import the get user model. And then I'm going to go ahead and declare user equals to get user model. Okay, so this is how we actually import that user model instead of doing something like from this actually doesn't work, but let's go ahead and say something like from auth.models import user, right? So we don't want to do it this way. Specifically for the user model. Every other model, we want to do it this way. For the user model, this is how it's done. And trust me, it's definitely the best way to do it. Regardless of how you see it anywhere else. I promise you this will be the least amount of frustration and headaches in the future. Okay, so now that we've got that user model, I'm going to go ahead and create a form itself. So how I actually go about doing this is, there's a couple things on how we can think about this. We could do a model form, much like we did with products, right? So if we come in here, we've got a model form in here, or excuse me, right here. We could do something very similar to that. Or we could just create standard forms and augment them as we see fit. I'm actually going to go the standard forms route and say login form, and this is going to be forms.form. Now the reason for this is I actually don't need much related to the user for this login form. There is things that I will need, but I don't need a model form for a login form especially. So what I'm going to do here then is I'm going to go ahead and say username equals to forms.char field, which is of course a character field. And then we'll go ahead and do password equals to forms.char field or character field. Now, of course, these are both required, so I'll leave them as just like this. So I'm not going to say required equals to false because we definitely need both of these. So now what I want to do is actually, well, I want to validate the username itself, but I also want to make sure that my form password actually renders out as a password. Now, I did mention before that there's a way to change classes and IDs. This is also a way to change the rendered input that it is by using an argument called widget. So inside a widget, we'll do forms.password input. Okay, so these widgets are plentiful. There's a lot of Django widgets. So just look Django form widgets, do a Google search for that. You will see all of the form widgets that are in here. And there's a lot of really cool ones. So text area is one of them. So if you needed long content, that is definitely a great widget there. But anyway, so we've got this forms.password input. that of course is going to hide from the user while they're typing. Now, password inputs, I don't know if it needs to be said, but it is a really good idea to use a password input on sensitive data. So it doesn't have to just be for passwords, but it definitely should be for any sorts of sensitive data. And you can leave it like this. This actually works just fine like that. Or what we can do is pass in something called attributes, so ATTRS, and these are HTML attributes. So stuff like class, if you want to add a CSS class, you can add form control if you're using Bootstrap. This is actually a really easy way to go about doing that, and you can also even change the ID of it here, saying something like user password. Okay, so there's our login form. Now again, I want to actually validate this is a valid username, so we'll just go ahead and say define clean username, and it takes in self, and we get the username equals to self dot. Now let me give us some space here. Self.cleanData.get and username. And now I'm going to go ahead and call a query set for this. So it's user.objects.filter username iExact equals to username. And then if not qs.exist, don't worry, I'll explain this stuff. We'll go ahead and raise forms.validation error and say this is an invalid user. Okay. Cool. So, and then finally, we'll return the username itself. Great. So this is a way to make sure that whatever username we're using, this is going to check that this username is correct. Now, iExact means that if somebody types in this is my username, that's going to be equal to this is my username. Because actually, we want to treat that the same in the database too. So capitalization doesn't matter in iExact. Okay, which is kind of ironic because you would think iExact means that it has to be exactly what they put in, but that's not how the query actually works. Okay, so now we've got our login form. Now I think actually you already know enough to go from here. But what I actually want to do is a little bit further than this, and I want to make sure that this is actually a valid user. So how do I actually go about doing that? Well, this is sort of saying that it's a valid user, but the actual password may or may not be valid, right? So this might be the incorrect password from or for this user. So we're going to add one more step, and that's define clean, and it's going to take in self. And now clean is actually the last method that's called. So it calls each individual username clean, right? So cleaning the individual one. And then the very last one is actually going to be looking for the entire form. What this means is I can actually come in here now and use username and password inside of here. So clean data.get and password. Okay, so this is now saying, hey, I can actually grab these two items in here on whether or not this is correct data itself, right? So this is actually where I can authenticate or verify that this user password is correct, right? So I can actually do additional form validation here inside of this clean method. And I'm actually going to leave that for another time, because what I'm going to be doing is inside of the view itself, I'll just go ahead and handle errors inside of the view. But in the long run, you would probably use clean in addition to clean username, or we could just spend a lot of time on clean itself. Okay, so I just wanted to mention those things because you absolutely might have additional form validation when it comes to something like clean. Okay, so let's actually jump back into view. Let's implement this login form now. So I'll go ahead and come in here and do from.forms, import login form. And then we're going to define the login view, takes in a request. And well, as usual, we're going to go ahead and say form equals to login form and request.post or none. And if form.is valid, then we will actually go ahead and grab the username equals to form.cleaned data.get username, and then we'll go with that same thing here for password. Okay, so the reason I'm doing it this method, as in not implementing this clean method, has to do with how I want to handle an invalid password, right? So maybe I want them to automatically move somewhere else, which we'll talk about in just a second. But so let's say we've got a username and password here. So now we actually need to authenticate this username and password. So the first step is actually doing what's called authentication. So from Django.contrib.auth, we're going to import authenticate. So what this does is it will give us a user if this authenticate is valid. So it's going to take in the request. It's going to grab the username equals to the username and the password equals to the password. Okay, so security things. We don't want to print out the password in here, right? So we very rarely want to print out this password at all, or any sensitive data that for that matter, because what that will do is actually stick in to your Django logs, right? It'll stick into the run server log there, which is not what we want to have happen. That's exposing our users' passwords. We definitely don't want that. So while you're testing, of course, you could try that out, but I would recommend against it in the long run for those print statements of that password. Maybe there's some way to get around that in the future, but as of now, there's not. Okay, so authenticate is saying, hey, is this a valid user and is this their actual password? That's pretty much it. And if it's not, what's going to happen is if user equals to none, that's what will happen. Is like this will actually return back none if it's an invalid password. Then what we can do is actually say request.session. Well, maybe we can do attempt plus equals to 1, right? So this is actually an option to add attempts in here on whether or not this user is actually correct. So we would actually do attempt equals to request.session.get attempt. Oops, too many there. And or 0, okay? And then you would actually probably do something more like this. Attempt plus 1. Okay, so this is also nice to verify whether or not this user has attempted this too many times. This is a really simple way to do that. I'm not going to fully implement that, but what's cool about this is it actually attaches to that session, as I mentioned before. This actually doesn't solve if somebody ends their session or uses a different browser or something like that. It's just a really simple way to monitor the attempts they have. The other thing about this is you could also then return some sort of redirect. So changing them in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and say invalid password, right? So this is going to then move them somewhere else, right? So that's an option for sure. The other thing is perhaps what we actually want to do is we're going to go ahead and return the render method of the request. And in this case, I will keep with form or forms, I think I called it. Let's go ahead and look at the template itself. Yeah, so forms.html. And I'll give the context, so the form itself as context. And then I'll also say invalid user being true. Okay, so that's just a very simple way to add additional, hey, this is an invalid user. Now in my forms.html, I can handle this invalid user. This is also true in other places as well, right? So now that I think of this concept of additional context that I'm adding to my template for forms.html, I can see this. And in my session, I can also do request.session and invalid user being 1. So 1 as in 1 equals to true. The reason I'm using 1 is it's a much smaller footprint, but then it's either going to be 1 or 0. But that's another way to add this into our template. So I don't necessarily need to also pass it in as context. I can use request.session to do that. So let's get rid of that from context. Okay. Don't worry, we'll see all this stuff in just a moment. But then the other option, if the user is not equal to none, then we can call the login method. So login. Okay, so a key thing here is notice that this is called login and this is called login view. Now, my intuition a long time ago was just to call this login as well, which actually overrides this name, right? So we've got a little issue there. So keep it in as login view, and you can also just call this as DJ login or as Django login or something like that, just in case you accidentally use login in a different manner. Okay, so logging in is now just saying login and the request and the user. So now request.user is going to equal to whoever that user is everywhere on your page until you actually log out whatever that user is or their actual session ends, both of which we will cover. So once we've got that, we can now go ahead and return a redirect to maybe the home page or something like that, right? And then of course, if the form is a GET call itself, we want to render out the form just like this right here. So we'll go ahead and add in that right there. Okay. So of course I could rephrase a lot of these things or reorder them. And since I'm repeating myself here and here, I actually do want to reorder them. So I'll go ahead and say if the user is not equal to none, then I'll go ahead and add that redirect. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and do that. And then the form will still be rendered. Okay. So just a kind of a reversal of what we were doing, so we're not repeating ourselves too much. And this right here is now going to be that requested user. Okay, so that is a long way to get our user actually authenticated into our project, right? It's actually not really that big of a deal, I hope. Maybe it is, maybe it feels that way, but it's really cool. So we've got our username and password in as secure as a manner as possible. In this case, and then we've got user equals to authenticate. So we actually verify the username and password details here. This is where we're saying, hey, this username and password is correct. And if it is correct, as in if the user is not equal to none, then we can go ahead and log in this user. So it's safe to say that user is valid and active. Like active, there is a field that we should probably look at called is active. That itself will also be a factor in here on whether or not this user should authenticate. Then they log in. Otherwise, they're going to be invalid users. Really, really simple. So logout is even more simple. So logout is another import we want to have here, just like we did with the login view. Just keep note of that. And we'll go ahead and do define logout view, takes in a request. And in this case, we just literally call logout on the request. And then we return, I don't know, a redirect maybe to the login URL. In this case, I'm just calling it /login. So this will redirect back to having the user log out, for example, obviously. But this actually removes the user from this request.user. This is now going to be anonymous user. Okay, so anon user that we can't actually use, as in they're not authenticated. Okay, so those are the login, logout views. Now I'm actually going to do the register form prior to actually implementing this as a URL and verifying the URL itself. So inside of my forms, oops, I think, no, I was just scrolled down in the wrong place. Okay, so inside of forms again, I'm going to come in here and say class register form. Okay, so forms.form, and very similar things. We're going to go ahead and use username and password here. And then I will come in and use password 1 and 2. So password 2, password 1. This time I actually want to change the label, so I'll go ahead and say label equaling to password. You'll see what that renders out in just a little bit. And this one, I'll just call this confirm password. Okay. And this ID will be user confirm password. Something like that. You don't have to change those IDs, but it's cool to see. Next, we are going to actually have email, and this is forms.email field. And I'm going to leave this required. So if by default required is true, Of course, you can change that flag to false if you'd like, but I'm going to leave it in as required. So much like we did with this clean username, what we want to do is the opposite of this. Okay, so the first one is we want to get the username. If it does exist, this is an invalid username. Please pick another. Now, in this case, I'm actually saying invalid username instead of this user has been taken. The reason for that is, well, we don't want everyone to know that a username is already taken, for example. I mean, you might want to know, people might want to know that, but I think by default, from a security standpoint, just saying, hey, this is an invalid username works not only if the username is taken, but it's also a username we don't want to have. So let's say, for instance, we want to have a not non-allowed usernames and put in a list of usernames in here, something like, let's say, ABC. We can also say, we might want to start with that one is say something like, if username in not allowed usernames, then we'll go ahead and say the exact same validation error. Okay. Again, this is only in register, which means that in the admin, I can still add users with these not allowed usernames. It's not actually changing the admin at all. It's only going to be changing how the view actually works itself. Okay. So with this same idea of clean username, we're also going to want to do the clean email. Right, so very similar to this, but in this case, it's not going to be the username field. It's just the email field. So let's change these to email. Okay, so if it exists, this is an invalid email. Please pick another. Okay, or this email has been used. This one, maybe. This email is already in use. So there we go. We now have username and email, and we haven't actually validated the passwords yet, but I will say that this is a very simple way to set up the register form itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring this into our view now. So I'm going to go ahead and do registered form, and we're going to essentially copy this login view, because what I'm also going to do is after they register, I'm going to authenticate that user and let them just log in. So define register view, takes in a request, and paste this whole thing in here. And yet again, we're going to go ahead and use that register form. We've got password and email. So email, password, and this was actually password 1, if I recall correctly in the form. So password 1, and then we've got password 2 here. So password 2. Okay, so naturally, I'm not actually going to authenticate just yet. Instead, what I'm going to do is go ahead and say user.objects.create user, and this is going to be our username, our email, and our password. Right, so this is actually the user object itself. Okay, so I don't actually need to authenticate this user, so I can get rid of that. And if there's any exception or any problems that happen with this, maybe it's a good idea to put it into a try block and say except user equals to none. And then that way we've got a registration error, or maybe just register error. And now we've got that error, right? And again, we can do the attempts as well if we'd like, but this actually covers doing a big part of the registration. So what I want to do is actually verify several things here. First is the login, then we will verify the logout, and then finally the register view. So let's go ahead and bring these into our URLs. So inside of Bootcamp, into URLs, we're going to go ahead and do from accounts.views, we're going to import the login view, the logout view, and the register view. Okay, so now that we've got those things, let's go ahead and bring them in. So, oops, that was a mistake. Sorry about that. Let's go ahead and say login and login view. Okay, and then logout view. Okay, and then the final one, which will be register and register view. Cool. So now that we've got those, let's go ahead and actually take a look on our site, make sure everything's running. Got my server running here, and of course, forms is not defined. The simplest thing that I could have imported, I did not. That's funny. Okay, so from Django, import forms. So we save that, and now I have no errors running so far. So let's go into a login page itself. And I got request object has no attribute post. Silly mistakes happen all the time. That's why we test things. That's this right here. That should be capitalized. I'm assuming that some of you caught that. I really hope that you did. But even if you didn't, we caught it now because Django is amazing and tells us exactly what's wrong and where to find it. Line 27 in login view, line 27 request.post. Okay, very simple error, very silly, easily solved. Okay, so we've got a username and password. Now, granted, if your Chrome browser or Safari or Firefox, whatever you're using, doesn't actually store the password itself, then this will be blank. In my case, it's not blank, so I've got this right here, and I can log in as that user. Now, I'm already logged in as that user, so let's go ahead and log out of that user. Okay, so it logged out and then redirected me. It's hard to see if it actually did log out. By one of the easiest ways is by going into the admin itself. Another easy way would be to actually use something called login required, right? So there's a decorator called login required. So let's go ahead and search for it. So login required decorator Django. This is how I remember things. I don't always remember it off the top of my head. If I've done it over and over, I absolutely do remember. But if I don't remember, I just search it, right? Just do a quick login required. And there we go. There's our decorator for login required. And you're like, I don't know what that means yet. That's okay. But we're going to go ahead and copy this decorator. And we're going to go to a place that actually absolutely makes sense for a login required, which is on products, on views, that good old product create view. We don't want to have anyone be able to do this. We want to only have some people be able to do this. So we bring in auth decorators login required. We come in here and we put in the login required decorator here. Okay, so now whenever we try to go in, I don't think I'm logged in, but now whenever we try to go to products create and hit enter, it's actually trying to redirect me to another URL to go ahead and log in, right? So this URL means that, yeah, you absolutely need to check that we need to change where that login goes. So there's a couple ways on how we could do this. The login required decorator allows you to pass in a login URL. This is fine every once in a while, but in my case, I actually want to set something in the settings. So in settings.py, what I actually want to set is right underneath the auth password validators. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and add in login URL equaling to login, and then login redirect URL being equal to /. Okay, cool. So now let's go ahead and log out again. Or actually, no, I haven't logged in yet. So let's go back into products, create, hit enter. Now it actually takes me to login, to the actual URL that's logged in here. Notice that there is this question mark next. This would actually, in theory, redirect us to that. That is something I'm not going to cover at this point, but it is kind of cool that there is something like that. The reason I'm not covering that at this point has to do with the fact that Django has a lot of their own login views, so authentication views themselves, as well as built-in forms. Okay, so if you actually want some of the benefits of the Django login related things, You totally can use their own views. But I wanted to show you how you actually make this happen prior to using, the login view here. This is a class-based view, which is something we also have not covered. So that's something that we are just going to have to leave for another time. But they do have these login views that handle stuff like next, because we want to handle those things as securely as possible. But again, that's like we're starting to get too advanced on these login views altogether. Okay, so there is another decorator that I wanted to mention, and that's because of those products create as well. Now, this is a site that people will log into. We don't want everyone to be able to do this. So we can also look for something called staff required login decorator Django. We hit enter here, and here's another kind of decorator. This is an old version of this, so let's not try that one. Let's go back in here and look for staff required, or I got the name wrong, staff member required, excuse me. So staff member required is very similar to the Django admin. So going back into our products here, very similar to the admin. We come down here and we do login staff member required, just like that. And now what it's going to do is force us to log in to the admin. And the things, as it says in this decorator, is user.isStaff equals to true and user.isActive equals to true. So those are two things that need to happen for this staff member required to be able to go to products and create. Okay, so in my case, this user is that way. But if I log out and log in with, I think it was jmitch and abc123, hopefully that's the password. Nope, invalid password. abc1234. Now, okay, so we're getting an invalid password there. So let's go ahead and actually register a new user. So again, I'll go ahead and say abc12345, and I'm just going to use this as an example with that same password. This is, yeah, that didn't actually work. So you're going, well, where are the errors here? Well, unfortunately, I don't have all of the errors showing up right now, but hopefully in the future we will have all of those errors. Okay, so this is an invalid user, so that error at least is showing up. Now, part of the reason that this error is not showing up, it has to do with how we are validating the passwords and all that. So let's go ahead and register this user with a better password. And no, still getting errors. So let's actually go back into our view and see what's going on. Okay, so we've got form valid. It's possible that the actual errors that are happening here are invalid. So let's go ahead and bring this up. And maybe there's an exception that's happening that I'm not realizing, and that's why it's actually just re-rendering the form itself. So let's go ahead and resubmit. Ah, yes, name user is not defined. Interesting. How silly is that? The user is not defined on the view itself. Silly mistakes happen too often. Okay, so user, get user model, and we want to define the user here. So user equals to that get user model. And there we go. That's why we don't always want to put things in try blocks before we test everything out. So let's go ahead and refresh this, resubmit. Okay, cool. So now the user should be logged in. And if I go to the admin, it shows me that I'm authenticated as this user. So what I want to show you just one more time is logging out. And we see, let's go ahead and register. And I'll go ahead and do ABC CFE or something like that. And then that same thing, email, password, there we go. Cool. So it goes to page not found. It goes to the root page. That's because we're basically saying that this user is logged in. And if we go to products create, it forces us to go to the admin. So this person is not authorized to access this page. So that's what's happening now. So it's now saying, hey, you need to be a staff user to do this. If we log in as a staff user and change that user's default permissions in here, right? So we've got all these users logged in. And if we come down here and change what their permissions are, they'll be able to see those various views as we put forth. Okay, cool. So now we've got several things going on with authentication. We now have a way to use these users themselves. So in that create view, something I actually want to add is the user model itself in the product. So let's go ahead and say user equals to models.foreign key. And to use the user model here, you're going to be like, oh, well, is it from django.contrib.auth import get user model? Is that the method we're going to use? Actually, no. Inside of models, and specifically models, not anywhere else, the way we grab the user model is from django.conf import settings, and then we use user equals to settings.auth user model. And this right here is actually what we'll set on our foreign key. You're like, what is a foreign key? We'll see that in a second. Hang on. And then we'll go ahead and do on delete, and this will be models.set null. So what this happens is if the user itself, the actual user object that's associated to this field is deleted, what do we do with these kinds of fields? Well, I said set null. I don't actually want to delete the product that's associated. So we'll go ahead and say null equals a true here. So if I actually wanted to delete all of the associations for this user, I would say set or models.cascade. And that would actually delete everything that's associated to the soon to be deleted user as well. Yes, that's getting a little bit outside of the context of hopefully basic, but the idea here is we absolutely need to have this on delete method in a foreign key, and we want to use that user model just like that. Okay, so I made a major change, and we actually haven't done this yet. We haven't covered making changes in a model. Now, just like we said before, when you create models, what you need to do is python manage.py, make migrations, and then python manage.py, migrate. You hit enter. That actually made all of the changes necessary. As we see here, add field user to product. So, hey database, we're about to change you, and then migrate, hey database, let's change you now. And it's doing it with a foreign key. So what a foreign key does is actually kind of correlate two tables together. So it's correlating the product table with the user table so that it's not actually just an ID of this user. It's like much more attached. So there's more efficient lookups that we can do related to that. Hopefully I'll be able to cover these things in more detail. Or no, let me rephrase that. I definitely will be covering these things in more detail next week when we start, day 6 or 7 to actually cover how to use these foreign keys in a more robust manner. But with that out of the way, let's get the server running again. And let's go into our view for the product create view. So right here, okay, so we've got our staff member required. Remember, we absolutely need to do that. Hey, remember this? Oh yeah, cool. Now I can say obj.user equals to the requested user, right? So the obj.user is of course the object itself. It's going to be related to this. If I was calling this owner equals to the foreign key of user, then you would just change that same thing on the view itself. But I just made it simple and called it user. So now every single time we add a product model or any given product to our product model, this will actually save it as the user itself. This doesn't change the admin at all. It only changes this view. So I get questions all the time. How do you customize the admin? How do you do all these crazy customizations? Sometimes it's really good, but sometimes it's a lot easier to just create your own view that has a login required for staff members. Anyways, so let's go ahead and actually see this in action now. So I'm logged in as CFE. Let's go to that view here. So products create, and we'll go ahead and say, hello world, I own this, or I created this, and some content. We hit send data. Okay, it looks like it's successful because it's a new form. We go into our products, our most recent one. Hey, I created this. Check that out. User associated. And I also have all of these other objects other options are other users, right? And this is how it's actually tied together. At least in the admin, we can now see that it's showing me literally every other user, so I can actually select those users. Which is not the only way to do this. I'll just say that. You can absolutely just put the user ID here and get it in different ways. But in this case, it's actually associated to it, which does all sorts of really cool things. One of them being that if that particular user is deleted from my database, it just sets this field as null. But if I wanted it to delete all of the things that that user has ever been associated to, I could use Cascade, which is a method that's really good for user-generated content, right? So if the user is deleting all of their account, how do you actually delete everything that's associated? It would be something like this. But in my case, I'm using this. The staff members only should be the ones that are actually creating or updating these things. So that's where that comes in. So that's pretty much it for login and register. I'm definitely going to be doing more things with foreign keys. So if that's not incredibly clear at this point, let me know. And I will say, I actually want to leave you with a challenge this weekend. This is something I will come back to, but there's an unbelievably key glaring weakness, and that is, how do I actually validate that those are the same passwords? How do I validate that you can confirm these things? So for the next couple of days, I want you to figure what that is out, and well, just let me know. Let me know in the comments of this video after it posts to YouTube, and tell me what it is that your solution was, because it's actually not that hard, and I definitely hinted towards it in another part. So I just really wanted to leave that challenge for the next couple days on how this is handled. So again, what I do want to recap though is the critical thing of this. Knowing this stuff makes using something like Django All-Auth or any third-party package that does authentication for you make a lot more sense, because now you understand that there's a lot more things that I could add to this register view. One of them being sending an email directly to this user to have them confirm that email. There's a whole set of features that we could build to make that happen, or we can actually just use Django All-Auth specifically for that. That will absolutely do that, assuming you have email set up on your page. The other part is password forgotten flow, as in they forgot their password. I have nothing in here that shows you exactly how to do that, other than when I mentioned there's that call, that instance method called, let's say, user object.set password. Yeah, we can absolutely set the password for any given user this way. So there is a way to do this password forgotten, but hey, might as well use this third party itself to do that. Yes, there are all these social authentication stuff, but way before you get there, you want to have the email address verification. Also having, check that out, multiple email addresses per user. A lot of really good stuff with Django All-Auth. Okay, so now I'm going to take some questions. I think this went. I went a lot more in depth in areas that I intended to just be a little bit more concise, but as we're talking about these things, I wanted to go in the depth and give you a really good look, hopefully a really good look in how Django handles authentication and potentially how you can handle registration, because now the user and the session are attached. Now, I didn't really go into the sessions too much, but the idea is as soon as you log out, that session will end. So this value will go away, whatever that value is, and it'll create a brand new session for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump over the questions. Let me just queue a few things up here real fast. Oops, wrong one. And we've got, here we go. Okay, so let's load up some messages here. Okay, so while that's loading, I will, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you got something out of this one. To me, user authentication is really important, but it can get a little dry every once in a while. You know what I mean? But it is a critical thing to do well inside of Django itself. So yeah, let's just keep that in mind. and I'm going to answer a few questions here, only a few minutes of questions. If you have a lot of questions, then I'll try and actually come back sometime this weekend to do a live Q&A that will answer questions in general. So stay tuned for that. That all depends on what we end up getting as questions. So yeah, let me just pull up some of the recent ones. You know, you planned to do more like 20-minute questions, but then we end up getting a lot more. Okay, so is that valid model.objects.filter count for login? Yeah, it's actually a very quick way to validate that query set exists or not. .count you can use count if you want to get more explicit as to how many items actually exist. So let's see, you said for login. I'm assuming you mean on the forms itself. I'm just going to go ahead and show others what you mean by this because I think this is a good question. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. So right here, I did if it doesn't exist, then we raise that. Another option we could do in here for this query set, there's something called count, and if query set.count equals to 1, if it's not equal to 1, or rather, instead of saying not, we would use that operator. If the count is not equal to 1, then we also might want to do that. If for some reason I have multiple users with the exact same username, this iExact becomes even more important there, because if you do something like if you have a 3 or another number there, iExact will take that in consideration versus something like I contains. There's another kind of lookup that you might find somewhere that these will be equivalent then, which is not what we want. We want to actually have the exact thing that's going on there, regardless of the capitalization. So good question. Thank you for that one. Let's see. All right, next one. They use email/token for login instead of username. So you're looking for a one-time password or OTP, where it actually emails you. I think Medium does this, where it emails you a link that you just click on and it logs you in. There are OTP packages, much like Django AllAuth, that you can use for this. And if you don't have a username, you might actually have to use a custom user model for that as well, where there's just no username. The username is your email. That is definitely something you can do with a lot of the method I showed you here on authentication. And I definitely cover this in one of my projects that it goes a lot more in depth to creating all of this custom user auth. It might have been in the Tweet Me Too project, where it's creating a Twitter-like application from earlier in 2020. That one itself, I think, covers the custom user and doing different kinds of authentication. Maybe not the custom user, but definitely different kinds of authentication with a very similar method as what we did here. Good question. Thank you for that. How to verify users by SMS. Okay, so I'll give you just a general overview or how you could go about doing this. First off, you will want to have a model that either has a foreign key relationship, so models.foreign key, or a one-to-one relationship, so models.one-to-one field, to a user, right? So you want to have that. And with that, you would also have a field specifically for their phone number. And then you'll use a service, something like Twilio to actually send the text message. So when you send the text message, you'll also want to have a unique code that corresponds to that text message that's happening, 1, for the model itself, 2, and then finally, of course, the actual phone number that's in there. So it actually associates all of those things. And then you just have a view. So when they click on the link that you send them with that custom key, it would actually go to a view on your production site, and you'd verify it that way. It's a multi-step process, but actually the verification part, the actual process, isn't really different with an email either. So you can learn how to do that in email, which I believe I cover in the e-commerce course that I have on my website. I'm pretty sure I cover the actual custom email verification as well. SMS isn't any different. You just need to use their phone number and email, or phone number instead of their email. Thanks for the question there. Can we use user equals authenticate? No, you cannot use this at all. So it has to be the request, the username, and password. So you can use an email as username using a custom user model. That's definitely outside the context of this bootcamp, but a custom user model will allow you to pass the email in as that username field. But of course, how would you authenticate a user by saying their username and their email? That fully doesn't make sense. You're not actually passing a password, some sort of sensitive data in there, right? So somebody could just guess this and get it right. I mean, somebody could guess the password too and get it right, but that's not something that you would want to do. So yeah, thanks for the question. Can I elaborate the difference between get user model and settings.auth user model? Yes, so get user model actually gets the user class. So it actually gets that user model class. Auth user model is just a string that points to where that user model class is. So let's actually take a look at that settings auth user model. Let me just pull this up real fast and then I'll show you. And here, okay. So here is the actual setting for auth user model. This is what you will use in models.py, right? So you could actually just use the string auth.user. So when you're doing a foreign key, a many-to-many field, or a one-to-one field, you could write this string out and it probably will work. But the reason that we call this instead of writing that string out has to do with substituting a custom user model and actually doing that. Certainly a lot more advanced than what we're doing here, but you still want to use best practices even if you're not at that advanced stage yet. So that's what you want to use in models.py when you're associating the user itself. So you don't, actually I think Django gives you an error now if you try to use the user model class itself. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. That was also a good question. Thank you for that. Why not to use get user model? That hopefully that I just answered that for you. Django itself, I think will ask for a string specifically. So it's really just looking for the database association, I think is sort of the way I think about it at least. Okay. Cool. For sponsorship, check my email and my Instagram DM. Thank you. Well, thank you for the super chat. And I will try to check those things out later today. Yeah. Okay. Can I do something on signals? Yes. I have a lot of different things on signals. So maybe at some point I will be able to come back to them. Probably not in the bootcamp though. Maybe. Next week I still have to plan out exactly what I'm going to be doing, but I've got nothing so far related to signals. But I think they are pretty useful. So yeah, take that with what you will. Okay. Next up. So can Django take a request keyword args and args via API? I'm not sure what you're referring to, and that sort of lies out of the context of what we covered today. So please keep these questions related to what we're doing today. If you want more general Q&A questions, just subscribe and make sure you hit the notification when I go live for the live Q&A sessions. That's what those are for. Okay, so in final projects are forms, model forms, and Django default auth used. Yesterday you mentioned something that forms and model forms should not be used in final projects. I don't remember ever saying that forms and model forms shouldn't be used. Both Django forms and Django model forms absolutely can and should be used in your final project. It's a really clean way to validate data. So perhaps I misspoke when I said that, but I will say that forms are really interesting and really useful when they're managed by Django. So our final project absolutely will continue along with that. perhaps there was some confusion with how to use forms with a authenticated user, and that was part of the reason we talked about it today. So thanks for that. So another question about OTP, but done by SMS. Yeah, you could do it roughly what I said before. I mean, well, I guess I mentioned a third-party package, but even verifying your email or your SMS with those one-time keys, once you're trying to verify that account, it's not any different verifying an account one time or using it as an OTP, a one-time password. It works identical. It's just you want to make sure that your session ends after a certain amount of time, which is something you'll want to learn more about on sessions themselves, because you don't want to have the session itself open for too long. You actually want it to expire after a certain amount of time so that those one-time passwords aren't incredibly insecure, right? So even if it's like a day or 5 hours or 2 hours or 30 minutes, it doesn't really matter. You definitely want to make sure that your sessions expire. Cool. What's the difference between forms and model forms? Day 4 covers this a lot. So I would say check out day 4. And that way you can really learn more about forms and model forms. You know, I think that's probably my best recommendation at this point. But basically model forms include a model in the form itself. It's just kind of extending standard Django forms to also use the fields inside of a model versus hard writing all of the fields. Thanks for the question. Which is better, Django built-in auth or the Django REST framework? These can work together. So to say that the built-in auth in Django is worse or better than the Django REST framework's authentication, I'm assuming that's what you meant by that. You can use session authentication, which is what we just did in the Django REST framework. Thanks for the question. You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for coming out and watching. How to set custom permissions. This is a good question. The documentation, I think, covers this really, really well. So now that you hopefully know how to use authentication, you will actually be able to see how to set permissions and use those in any given view. I think using decorators is really nice for that. We already saw the staff member required decorator. That one checks those permissions. So yeah, thanks for the question. Yo, what up? Let's see here. I'm not sure what you mean by that. But yes, I went fast because I'm trying to cover a lot. So I really want to get the baseline Django stuff. And I think we're really close to having a lot of the baseline there. We still have to do testing, which who knows how much we'll be able to actually cover in the gamut that is testing. But I do want to do testing, and then we'll actually start flushing out the order process of these products. We already have the products there. We need some images too. So those are a few things I'm going to be covering next week. Thanks for the question. How to make validation show. So forms.validation error. If you're using a standard Django form rendered inside of a template, the validation will absolutely show. I had a HTTP 500 error, or actually I had a try block exception in there earlier that caused a little bit of a hiccup, but that wasn't a validation error. That was an import error. Not really related to the form, just related to not actually doing all the imports. And that would actually not run an error for the user unless you moved it out of that try block, which is what I did and how I figured that part out. Let's see here. Cool, maybe just a couple more minutes for this. Thanks for the other super chat. I'm not going to put that up because you're mentioning sponsors itself there. But thank you for that. I will get back to you hopefully soon related to that. Do we need to, this is a good one. So do we need to create a new app to handle user authentication? No, you do not. You can use Django All Auth at this point. I think that would be a good choice. I definitely need to have its own standalone video for something like that. But if you create a new app, it just keeps things self-contained. That's why I do it. When in doubt, for your apps, just make it as self-contained as it possibly can be, and then you'll be in good shape. So if you're doing custom auth like I did, then yes, you probably should. Custom auth in the sense of the flow, the authentication flow is custom. The actual authentication and the user model itself, all of that was the built-in stuff. You could use the built-in Django views as well. There's a number of examples online on how to do that, and I'm sure I cover exactly those things in one of my projects. Maybe one of you guys know about it. Cool, thanks for the question. What about Google and Facebook authentication? Yeah, so the Django All-Auth actually gives you some documentation on this. It's actually quite a bit more complicated because they use something called OAuth 2, which requires you to have callbacks and ways to handle. So if you've logged in with Google, for example, what happens is it actually brings you to a Google web page. Usually it's in like a smaller pop-up or something like that. And then on Google, you actually log in, select the account that you want to use, and then that actually sends a callback token to your actual application. So that extra step makes it a little bit harder to set up. So yeah, Django All-Auth makes all of that much easier, although it still can get a little complicated. So that's definitely outside the context of this bootcamp. So maybe in the future we can do a bootcamp on it, or I could just make more videos related to Django All-Auth for this authentication stuff. I definitely have a whole on series of Django All-Auth on cfe.sh. That's my website right there. So cfe.sh, just not the YouTube. That's how you can actually go about learning about All-Auth. I think I might cover both Google and Facebook, but there's a number of steps there that just takes a while. Yeah, so I briefly mentioned this when we covered models. So blank equaling to true means that Django itself, and specifically in the forms, it's not required. So when you're using that field, it will allow blank values to be in there. It's specifically for Django. It doesn't actually have to do with the database at all. Null equals to true has to do with the database, and that means that the database field itself can be null or completely empty, as in no string value, just nothing in there. That's the option for that. Okay. So let's see here. Okay, I think that we're getting a number of questions. Yeah, so I just answered this one. And this was covered in the models part for sure. So maybe go back and watch that one over again. All right. Okay, well, it looks like we're getting a number of things that are outside the context of this. I know about login, logout, search, and CRUD in Django. Can I say that I am a developer? Sure, go ahead. You can say whatever you want to be, whatever you want, right? Like you can call yourself whatever. Now, to be an actual paid developer is a whole different story. So to get there, just start freelancing, and then you can definitely say that you're a developer, and other people will be like, well, that's cool. Silly question. Okay. So we need to discuss multiple query sets. We definitely need to discuss query sets more. This will definitely be something I come out with in the future. So yeah. Okay, guys. So that's going to do it for the questions. I went a little bit longer on the questions today, mainly because the code part took a little bit longer than I initially anticipated. But hey, hopefully you got a lot out of this one. Thanks so much for watching, and have a good weekend. Definitely check out that challenge that I left you at the end of the coding part. I really hope that you guys can solve that. I will, depending on the feedback from you, I may or may not actually solve it for you. I might just leave it open-ended because it's one of those challenges that I think you can do now. All right, so thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys